Good afternoon and welcome to the QCA Equality, Diversity and Inclusion webinar. Sorry for the slight delay in starting this event today. Throughout this recorded meeting, attendees will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged. You can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of the screen. Just simply type in your question and press send. I'd now like to hand you over to Claire Noyce, Deputy Chair of the QCA. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone for joining us today as we discuss equality, diversity and inclusion, continuing our exploration of ESG principles with a focus on this critical governance pillar to explore practical steps to foster inclusive workplaces, recent regulatory developments, and why EDI matters for small and mid-cap companies. So whether you're from a small cap or a mid-cap company, this afternoon's session will provide you with actionable insights and practical guidance on navigating the evolving EDI landscape. Welcome to our guests. We're particularly pleased to welcome both Simon Fanshawe OBE from Diversity by Design and Nina Nuzi from Ocorian, who will share their deep insights and experiences of driving meaningful change through effective EDI strategies. Perhaps just a little bit for our audience about Simon and Nina. Simon, you join as a diversity consultant, broadcaster and author. You're the co-founder of Diversity by Design, which works on EDI. You've started and sold 2 companies in radio and comms, written 2 books, and had a board-level career for over 35 years. You've long been involved in higher education, particularly as chairman previously for Sussex University and now as the rector at the University of Edinburgh. Particularly for our interest today, you've been involved in campaigns for equality and positive social change, and in fact were one of the 6 co-founders of Stonewall. Thank you, Simon, for joining.
Well, thank you for asking me. Can't wait to meet me. I sound fascinating.
Absolutely. And Nina, thank you also for being with us here today. I see you're a Chartered Governance Institute qualified professional with experience of working in a listed environment and professional services. You join us, Nina, as Corporate Services Manager at Ocorian, leading their UK Corporate Services team, specialising in providing secretarial services and ensuring compliance with governance frameworks for FTSE-listed organisations. Welcome, Nina.
Thanks, Claire.
So just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to say that the webinar is open both to QCA members and non-members, and would be delighted after the event if you are a non-member, if you would like to reach out and explore membership with us. I believe during the seminar, you can actually pop any questions in the chat online, and both myself, Simon and Nina would like to make this as interactive as possible. We'd like to answer all of your questions if we can. Perhaps I'll start with one of our own to kick off here. So EDI, always a live topic, a gigantic topic, in fact. I can see that only this morning Nestle shares opened down more than 2.5% as it dismissed its chief executive after an investigation into an undisclosed romantic relationship with an employee. Only last week, there was a FTSE 250 property developer calling in lawyers to investigate allegations that diversity data was misused surrounding allegations of sexual harassment, manipulation of diversity and inclusion data to boost bonuses internally. So from your perspective, Simon and Nina, from a corporate governance perspective, what are the most significant EDI challenges facing listed companies today? And how are governance frameworks within companies, in your experience, evolving to address these EDI challenges that listed companies are facing? Simon, do you perhaps want to kick us off there? The View Live examples just this morning and last week, and how companies should approach this and what kind of frameworks you're seeing in place at best practice.
You made the point at the beginning that EDI has come to cover an enormous sort of clown's pocket of issues. I think I'd make a distinction between the strategic issues around EDI and then some of these behaviour issues, if I can separate out those two. So I think what you've got with listed companies and the FCA and the PRA backed off asking for mandatory reporting of EDI data, but they haven't backed off non-financial misconduct and the code of conduct. So that would cover the sorts of things that you're talking about. That is not my expertise at all. Where I think that they're probably right to have backed off that mandatory reporting, because it offers an opportunity, I think, instead of reporting, oh, we've got more of this and less of them, or more of them and less of them, which is all the input data, which is typically how people think of this stuff. What I would say is, I think for listed companies, the key thing to do in the first place is not is to think about what you want to do specifically in your company. That would be my starting point, because whatever challenges there are out there in the external world, and there are some legal challenges at the moment if you work across the US and the UK, but I mean, just looking at the list here, there are people on the call who are in financial services, mining, law, digital comms, manufacturing, defense. There's a whole range of companies. So my very first thing would be to say that the way to deal with this, I think, is to get right back to basics and say to yourself, what kind of diversity specifically in my company, in my sector, with my strategic goals, what kind of diversity and balance between men and women, different cultures, etc., what kind of diversity is going to help me make that company sing? So that's the first thing to do, I think, is to really be specific. And that's the best way of meeting these challenges, because once you start doing that, you'll move away from some of the more the stuff that's being attacked at the moment, which is sort of race-based recruiting or female-based recruiting. You get out of that territory into the territory that says, what's the combination of people I can put together in my business, and what do they bring through their experience, both professional and personal? So my first thing would be to meet the challenges on head on. Be specific about your company. Don't, get beyond the generalities, I think, is the first step.
Yes, I think absolutely separating out the strategic issues and then working within the frameworks. I mean, working within frameworks is something, Nina, in your day job that you do very much with listed companies. Be keen to hear your approach. Be keen to hear, when you meet a company for the first time to work with a new client, what kind of questions do you ask if they're feeling that their EDI is stagnant, or that they, in fact, as we've seen with a few of the listed companies used as examples earlier, need to perhaps up the game?
So Claire, as you mentioned those examples following this week's event, I wanted to actually link it with an interesting stat that actually caught my eye this week, where more than half of FTSE 100 CEOs appointments in the past year were externally recruited. And the reason why I think this would link well is, for example, for these urgent situations that have happened this week, I wonder if these companies have in place urgent succession plans, because a key challenge that I do witness is the uneven progress at senior level. So I think from a board level, UK companies look more balanced than ever in terms of gender. But I think as we drill a bit deep in terms of the ESCO pipelines and further down to senior management, I think there's a lag, especially for women, ethnic minorities. And I know that obviously the FTSE Women's Leaders Review set a 40% target for women across boards and leadership by end of 2025, but progress has been mixed across those sectors. I think also the frameworks are generally evolving. I know that we've had the UK Corporate Governance Code this year, which tightens all expectations around culture, succession and evaluation. So boards are expected now to show how cultures are assessed, embedded and overseen as a whole. So I think with this now, they're going to be able to target slightly better how they can manage urgent succession plannings should similar events arise in their companies.
Yes, and I think
there's a sort of logic to it too. I think I like to think of it in two buckets, really, two focuses. If you think about diversity deficits and diversity dividends, and I know when you say a deficit, in the sense a deficit has to be tackled, and so there's an obligation there, but you have to alliterate in my job, so deficits and dividends. The deficits are where you see imbalances. And so that's useful, and it's useful in terms of those codes, the sort of things that Nina was just implying there. You look at the various codes, and they give you direction of travel, they give you aspiration, and you can measure some data on that. If you're really careful using big groups, I mean, you can't just sort of crush together BAME, black and minority ethnic people, because you need to collect data that's going to give you insight, and you might find that the experiences of those groups of people are different. But what I would say is that if you separate it into those two things and are specific, in the way I was saying before, then what you start to do is you start to say, well, what is the baseline that I'm using to think about diversity? And the first baseline's got to be, what are you trying to achieve? So if you're a fire service, we're working with a bunch of fire services at the moment. We're also working with a couple of water companies. These have completely different objectives. I mean, I'm always joking with the water companies. I mean, they have their business plan model is pretty simple. It's water in and what's it out. That's kind of what they do. Now, it's quite sophisticated in between that. But actually, they're regional monopolies. They have apprenticeship programs which have a relationship to the demographic, but then they have a whole load of stuff around innovation and pollution and environment and technology and engineering. They exist in a specific sector. They have very particular objectives, which would be different from, say, a global business school or a fire service. So the key thing, I think, with all of this is to build on what Nina was saying, is you use those not regulatory, but the kind of voluntary regulatory things to give you a direction of travel, but actually do what you need to do for your business first and think very specifically and answer that exam question in terms of the deficits and the dividends. What am I doing this for? So that when you measure, you can measure what you're trying to achieve and whether you've achieved it, not just what you put in, but what you got out.
Thank you, Simon. That's clear. So I understand how you would go into a business and you really want to understand from the management that sat in front of you their objectives, and from that starts to formulate some kind of storytelling of their own EDI story in terms of deficit and dividend. I like that. I imagine, Nina, when you're working with companies, also from an Ocorian perspective, there's reporting mechanisms, there's metrics, there's frameworks that you would recommend, and perhaps ones that you would use less. For our listed companies on the webinar, and feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A, but with respect to the listed companies, are there any reporting mechanisms and frameworks that you particularly recommend, or ways of going about it? And Simon's talked there about the dividend, the deficit, the storytelling, but when it comes to also, there's some very strong measurement part to this.
So I think it's not necessarily slightly easier, but I think for the main market, there's standard tables for board and executive management, both by gender and ethnicity, that they need to either meet or explain if they haven't been able to achieve those annual targets. So I think a lot of companies use these reference date each year, and they reconcile the narratives and the numbers to sort of measure the progress, which a lot of companies seem to find useful. But I think what would be highly useful as an additional add-on, although not a requirement, would probably be to track the pipelines for further down. So, for example, the percentage of women, ethnic minority representation further down. What is the sort of the hiring, promotion and attrition rates by these groups, just to generally spot any leaky pipes and identify what they can target.
You've really got to understand things in detail too. I mean, there is, one of the assumptions is that if there's a disparity in outcome between men and women, or black and white, that's due to either sex or race. And the reality is it isn't always. It can be due to all sorts of things. If you work in engineering, you've got a very different pipeline than if you work in hospitality or retail. So sometimes it's historic, sometimes it's related to the particular sector. I think there are three kinds of measurements that are useful in addition to what you're talking about, Nina. I think one is to measure engagement of staff rather than satisfaction. The key thing about our staff engaging with each other, and there are various different ways of doing that. The second thing, I think, when you're talking about measuring culture, and therefore that's the ability really of the organization, the listed company, to achieve what it wants to achieve, kind of our staff working well together, then I think what you can measure, and there are quite a lot of good measurements on this, is the ability of staff to speak freely with each other. So that's an important measurement. And the third thing is that there is input data, but I just say again, don't confuse input data with outcomes. And when you talk about, sorry, that's somebody probably trying to sell me. They normally try and sell loft insulation, and I live in a flat, etc. The third thing is with the input data. I'll give you an example. We work with a pharma company that it actually had two staff groups. I'm going to use an example, but for a particular reason. So they had an Asian leadership group, Asian Heritage Leadership Group, and then a Black Heritage Career Development Group for very particular reasons, because in pharma, there's no shortage of people from an Asian heritage working. It's a very popular career amongst families and young and other people, other Asian people.
Is that hence the title leadership group?
Yeah. So
right.
So in other words, you would look, it seems to me, you would want to look at what you're trying to understand about your Asian staff population in that context, differently from what you would try to understand about the Black heritage population, where there are very few leaders and people typically are lower down in the organization. So the data that you use that Nina's referring to, and I know she agrees with this, it's got to give you insight. It's no good just saying, oh, well, because you wouldn't do that with anything else. I mean, you really wouldn't with any other strategy. So you've got to be really quite careful about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it.
Absolutely agree, Simon. I do think it's very important to sort of understand the motivations for collecting that data. I think organizations can often fall into the trap of collecting the data but not actually using it to inform the initiatives or efforts that they're using, whether it's to attract, retain or develop their talent.
And do they use that, Nina, as a sort of, when it comes to comply or explain, they go, oh, well, we collected lots of data, aren't we good? And you go, actually, well, you didn't do anything with it, so no. Would that be the case?
Absolutely. And I think that can go back to the initial question raised by Claire in terms of the challenges. I think sometimes when you're reading these annual reports, and I do sympathise with organisations as well, because the requirements have become more lengthy and the reports are extremely more detailed than before. So if you were to close an annual report and not know the name of that company, sometimes the wording used is very much template wording, which just goes to show that the comply and explain approach is not being used as supposed. It's not being used in an authentic way to actually explain and have a plan implemented, but rather just for a tick boxing exercise, which defeats the purpose of the progress, because of course tick boxing is not the change. The actual culture shift would be the progress achieved by these organizations.
Thank you, Nina. And talking there then about historical data collection, some of the real life case studies that we've seen, unfortunately, in the press over the last week. But thinking forwards, are there challenges that you feel boards should be preparing for now that are not necessarily on an EDI radar, that you both see in your day jobs and in working with management teams and boards? What's coming up that we can educate and share with our small and mid-cap companies online with us today?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that's useful to think about too is to think about, what does a board want to think about and discuss in relation to EDI, and what does an exec team want to think about and discuss? Because they are quite different in a way. And I think I don't think boards are, my experience of boards is they're not as clear about it. They do tend to, somebody turns up and gives them the input figures. So they typically get a report on diversity, which is typically, we've got more women, hurrah, less women, boo. And actually, what I think they need to do is go back to this strategic thing. So one of the things I think boards should think about is, what's the intent? What are we trying to achieve by these policies, and are we achieving them? And that means not just, are we achieving them, good boy, bad boy? In other words, are the actions we're taking achieving the outcomes that we want? So I think boards, you should think strategically. I think that and the other thing that boards is very difficult to do is, how do boards measure, how do they measure culture and the success of the culture? So I think that's one set of things. And
how do they, Simon? What's your advice on a small company? There could be some very small companies on this call. How do they measure how employees are engaging with each other, and how do they measure culture?
I think the best one is to use speaking freely measurements. I mean, literally ask people whether they feel they're able to challenge up to managers, for instance. What happens? Are they able to disagree well within teams? Are they able to contain conversations to work rather than allowing them to spread out into other issues which might be divisive, and so on and so forth? But you were saying, what are the future? I think one of the things that people are finding most challenging at the moment is that there are these highly divisive social issues, that social media is exacerbating the divisions and the lack of nuance in the discussion, and that's seeping into work. We worked with one of the regular staff asking them to take a position on Israel and Gaza, and you go, well, hang on, What is that to do with regulations? So I think one of the things that's really challenging for leaders at the moment is to maintain that sense of impartiality on issues that, whatever side you take on the issue, they're by their nature divisive. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing, just to think about what's going on, if you're working across the states and here, you know, one of the things about the executive orders and the pushback is that, you know, like all things Trumpian, about a 12th of what he says is useful or sensible or, you know, worth thinking about, because he puts his finger on something. And what I think he's put his finger on here is that there are tactics that were useful at certain particular moments in time that are not useful. They're tactics, they're not principles. Affirmative action being a classic one, but also don't confuse supporting BLM, Black Lives Matters, with tackling racial discrimination in your company. In other words, think about whether these things that are being presented in the EDI narrative, are these just tactics? Are they really, will they really achieve what I want to achieve in my company? Don't just assume and accept them. And I think there's a lot of that is now kind of coming up against the crash barrier now. And so it's worth getting back to the fundamentals, which are, let's make sure we remove blocks to talent. And then that means we need to understand them, tackle them, and remove those blocks so people can flourish in, up, and across companies. And then let's combine them to achieve the aims we've got. And that involves, I think, keeping your staff together. So I think it's worth thinking at the moment, particularly again, about what is your policy about what is and isn't talked about at work on formal platforms. You know, that is fraught at the moment. And I think it's worth saying to people, is this helpful to us working together? And I try and use words helpful and unhelpful to us working together rather than right or wrong or good or bad. Because ultimately what we're trying to do at work is get on in order to make pizzas, mine for tin, you know, run our financial services, whatever it is we're trying to do.
Very, very good. Very clear. Nina, what do you see in your recent experiences looking forwards that boards are trying to prepare for or grapple with?
So I have a slightly different significant challenge that I think the boards in general should be prepared for, and it's more specific, and it's actually AI. So I know obviously AI has the potential to transform the boardroom practices and improve them, and absolutely should be used for that. But I think AI is also increasingly used in HR processes, particularly around automated CV screening, interview analysis, performance scoring, promotions. Also, I know that recently there's been AI bots that's been appointed as board advisors to some global companies. So I think the whole atmosphere is changing in general for boardrooms. So I think companies should really be responsible and show that they can demonstrate how they're overseeing AI and have the appropriate guardrails that investors might be looking into. I know investors view AI as a big part of corporate governance and risk oversight at the moment. So it's important that companies are not facing any investor scrutiny, but this way also ensuring that individuals are not screened out for odd reasons, and the board has the appropriate answers in place should there ever be questioned.
Okay.
And looking at it from a risk point of view, to build on that is be very careful with your use of AI. AI is notorious because of social media and where it gets some information. So be very careful about the kind of advice you get. So, for instance, it will give you faulty advice on single-sex spaces. It may well give you faulty advice on questions of race, because an awful lot of information in there. So be really careful about your sources and what you're feeding it. And I know that's really obvious and people know far more about it than I do. We are just in the process of putting together a report where we're looking at where organizations have got their policies right and they've got their practices right, and where they've got them wrong, and the practices and policies. And the idea is that we're trying to produce an audit tool. In other words, an AI-based tool where you'll be able to put your policies in basically, and it'll show up red flags. But I mean, for instance, if you want to know about the law around sex and gender, just use the Supreme Court judgment. Don't go generalized with it. Get down and really use reliable sources of law, because an awful lot of what's gone wrong, the stuff that's not working with EDI, comes from faulty advice.
Good advice there, Simon. And Nina, just coming back to this AI point, which is an excellent one that you raise. How do, again, smaller companies go about practically thinking here? Is it about a review of policies and procedures with respect to AI? Is it about thinking, coming back to succession planning, Simon, that you alluded to right at the start, succession planning to the board, that there is somebody with respect to experience in AI, might be too grandiose, but somebody that has a view and input to have in the AI space? Is that what's needed? But where do you advise smaller companies to put their efforts in thinking about these things?
I think definitely in terms of the processes in place, but ultimately always having a human individual reviewing the final outcome of the final results, whether irrespective, whether you're employing a regular staff member or a senior NED on a board. I think the outcomes should be sort of reviewed and make sure that the wrong individuals have been accidentally screened out for the reason. So ensuring, also working with the relevant departments, technology departments, to ensure that they've got the correct systems in place and their systems are compliant with the governance requirements.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you, Nina. Simon, you touched on something there that we don't necessarily want to go down completely as a rabbit hole. There's lots of rabbit holes in this topic, but the US, you may have some companies feeling that there's some kind of scale back on all things EDI as a result of what's been going on over the pond over the past 12 months. Is it an opportunity? Is it a good opportunity to embrace and get ahead, or is it a threat to the landscape currently, and how should companies be reacting to this? And very interesting advice there that you gave when it comes to conversation in the workplace and divisiveness. There's so many divisive topics, and leaders, CEOs rising above the opinions, let's say, that could be the stands that could be taken. Simon, is there a view there?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions in there. One, I think, is what's interesting is what is fueling this pushback. When I say this thing about, when I say that Trump gets 1 out of 12 things right, don't confuse, anybody should confuse that with a view that I think in any way he's, a good thing. I don't, but something's happening, which is encouraging people to push back about what they see as EDI. So one of the questions is, what are they pushing back against? And I think they're pushing back against not the fundamentals. If you go and ask leaders in the States or the UK, do you still think it's important to widen your talent stream, to make sure that people can fulfill their potential? I think that's absolutely fundamental. So that core work on diversity is not what people are pushing back against. What they're pushing back against, as I said before, I think are the tactics. So if you think of affirmative action, if there's a wonderful conversation between Lyndon Baines Johnson and one of the leaders of the rather strangely named NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, progressive organisation, important civil rights organisation, which still works today. And it's a conversation where he's talking about two black men one of whom he wants to promote to an ambassadorship. And he uses this slightly clunky phrase, but he goes, look, I want more men, he says, obviously, more men like them. I want them to be in running distance of where we are, or walking distance of where we are. Now, it's slightly awkward language, but what he's saying is, let's use affirmative action. And to get people, he talks about getting people their 12%, and he was making the equivalence between the 12% of the population or whatever. So what he's talking about there is a tactic to bring people on. That tactic is now rebounding in certain ways, because if you start talking about identity on the left, or black or gay or whatever, you're going to start having it on the other side. The white identity, people are going to say, well, we want a bit of identity politics as well. So I think there's one is to accurately identify what's the pushback against. So I'll give you an example. In a fire service, it was actually a firefighter transitioned, and the fire chief didn't write a letter to everybody, he allowed the person who transitioned to do it. And in that letter, which I think was the wrong choice, set that aside, in the letter was this sentence which said, "Don't worry if you misgender me, just apologize and we can move on." What was interesting to me working with this whole senior management, I was working with 50 of them. What was interesting was that they didn't object to being asked to think about how they might adjust to a new situation. What they objected to was being told what to think. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic in there. So what I would say is there are two things. One is you have to be compliant, and there appears to be some disagreement, I think, at the moment around between general councils about exactly what will be compliant. In other words, can you run a women's leadership program? Probably yes, actually, but you have to be careful about how you do it. But what you can't do is appoint people apparently on the basis, so you can't have racial or sex-based quotas. So you're going to have to think about the legal advice. But what I would say is that's a technical matter for people who are not me. But what I think I can contribute is just to ask people to think, what are people pushing back against? So how do I frame what I'm doing in EDI in terms of fairness and talent and company goals rather than identity-based targets? Do you see what I mean? I don't think that's just dancing on a pin and changing language. I think that's changing an approach so that we're really doing the fundamentals. And the other thing is, don't sign up to activist organizations of any kind for your advice or your policies or whatever, because they will inevitably have a particular view.
And Nina's smiling at that. I think she may want to.
With people I say sometimes to people, do you support Black Lives Matter? They go, absolutely. And I say, you think it's important, don't you, to root out discrimination in your organization? They go, absolutely. And I say, fantastic. Do you want to defund the police? They go, sorry? and that's the difference. Yes, you want to tackle discrimination, but you don't want to sign up to somebody else's agenda. So beware of charters, activist organizations, all of that, and just get down to your knitting, really, your core objectives, and then take good advice on your US compliance.
Yes, absolutely. Nina, do you have anything to add there from the US actions?
I think it's nuanced, to be honest. I mean, if it's framed correctly, the main market companies, they could turn this into an advantage because they've got the strong regulations imposed on them. They've got the investor focus. They have the measurable progress, so they can create competitive advantage. But I think when it comes to AIM markets, for example, the AIM space, the regulations are more relaxed, so it can turn this into a reputational risk or even a capital access risk because there's no rules. So investors are watching, and the progress simply isn't there at the moment. I mean, at the beginning of the year, there was some data actually released from the Adidas and Indigo report for the 2025 gender diversity in AIM and company boards. And I recall them actually, just simply saying that the data was disappointing this year. The statistics were not as expected. And it is that thing when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. So unfortunately, sometimes it does impact whether it's private companies or the smaller cap companies, which are subscribing to the less regulations, the more relaxed requirements.
Well, I read a fascinating piece yesterday written by the chief executive of some kind of coalition of charities in the States. I couldn't quite work out who they were, but she sounded like, really interesting. She was saying, black woman, she was saying, stop doing race-based diversity. Let's do socioeconomic-based diversity, because we know that actually the people who really are disadvantaged are people who are in lower income levels. And actually that disproportionately will help people who are poor, and many of them are black, many of them are Latino, and so on and so forth. And when she was reading it, I started reading it, and I did that thing of thinking, I'm not sure. I think I do agree with it. I sort of changed as I went through the piece because I thought it was really articulate. So base it on real understanding of what the issue is that you're tackling. So if you're trying to widen talent, you really need to understand why people are not applying, why they're not getting promoted, why they're not getting deployed. You really need to get to grips with that. And it is harder work, but it'll really pay and you talk about the investors. Investors want to see a return on this. You know, it's no good any longer just saying, oh, we think it's the right thing to do.
Well, that's right. They want to see a return, full stop, first and foremost.
They want to see outcomes, you know.
Yes.
And the other thing they don't want to see is they don't want to see risk. So, I mean, one of the things that's important in this country is to be really careful about tribunals. Now, look, it's not a cyber risk. I mean, you know, if you lose a tribunal, it's not going to stop your organization operating. But I'll tell you what, the awards are getting far higher. So it becomes very expensive to do it. People are more likely to appeal because they can crowdfund and so on and so forth. So it's an expensive job, but it's reputationally damaging, this stuff. I mean, you will have followed recent tribunals in this country. There was one that was widely reported yesterday in Scotland in the NHS. I mean, this is seriously damaging reputations of places. And investors,
not where boards want to be at all.
And investors don't want to see this. Boards don't want to deal with it. So be clear about what your policies are. Don't run yourself into dodgy advice and therefore into the room.
Absolutely. I'm looking at some of the questions. So one from Louis C, which plays into succession planning and boards and some of our discussions. I'll read it out for our audience. Are people with people skills underrepresented on boards, and why is this? Are boards still too focused on numbers, so the accounting side of things, and legal, so lawyers? Are we lacking in UK companies? Let's talk about UK listed businesses. Are we lacking a focus on boards with people skills, and rather looking for our accountants and lawyers to populate our boardrooms? I don't know if either of you have a view there, or any examples or anything anecdotal.
I think it goes back to the data collection. I think it's a bit difficult to give a precise answer, only because it depends on what the company's collecting and what their main requirements are to collect that data. So I know a lot of businesses, of course, use the skills matrix on different boards, and unfortunately, if people's skills, it's not on that matrix, that might not be at the top of the list for those particular boards, and therefore those type of individuals are not trickling through. So I think it very much, once again, depends on the understanding and the education of the board members and what they're targeting specifically for their companies.
I think there are a couple of things there too. One is, I assume by people skills, the questioner is talking about the more formal sort of HR, chief people officer things. I think there's two things. One is, I'd go back and just re-emphasize that point, that I think boards have got to be clear about, if you say people are our most important asset, then you better not have that as item 11 on your agenda. I mean, talent, culture, succession, that's kind of right up there. So take it up the list of priorities and think about, what data do I need to commission, and what I want them to tell me, etc., and how we measure. So some of the things we've said already. I think the other thing too, which relates to that, is I think that I went to an event the other day, and it was, the kind of challenge was, you know, why do CPOs and others not get a better hearing at the board? And it was quite interesting listening to CPOs say that actually they don't think they've got their relationship or the narrative that they bring to the board. They need to work on that. In other words, they need to bring the more strategic questions. They need to bring board level questions to the board. And that what they were all saying about themselves is they didn't feel they were doing that, and therefore not getting the status and credibility. And there is also another question, which I think somebody pointed out, and I will pass on to you, was that she said it was her experience, because there were so many women involved in people-based parts of the organisation, and boards were so full of men. Actually, there was an element of sexism there, and that actually the men didn't think they thought it was all a bit, well, you know, the women will deal with that. Now, I'm not saying anybody on this call thinks like that, but it was an interesting kind of comment from her experience. But I think what it means is you've got to find strategic ways of getting the board's attention to say, actually, this is a number one issue. This is not an AOB. It's a real top issue, and we need to understand what we're trying to understand, what we define as our problems, how we measure them, and so on.
Yeah, and absolutely. And just touching on those CPOs then that feel they don't have the board level questions to bring to the boardroom, and therefore feel disadvantaged. For both of you, really, what types of board level questions would you suggest a non-exec, a potential non-exec, could bring into the boardroom about this topic more widely? I guess thinking about it with respect to less about compliance, more about strategic advantage, back to the US question. So what questions could we give to our non-execs in this audience that would enable them to demonstrate these are board level questions, board level concerns? Is there any thinking there? Nina, do you have some examples?
I would say a key question would probably be to ask the NEDs how we're educating these NEDs to understand and champion EDI authentically, because diversity is such a wide subject, and I know at the moment it's only gender and ethnicity in terms of requirements, but the scope could widen in the coming years, and some boards are only a few individuals, so it will be physically impossible to meet those requirements. So I think if the NEDs have a clear understanding in terms of how to champion the EDI within their organization, then it will be easier for them to target one particular element that might not even be on the requirement, but at least they can use the compliant explain approach appropriately, and even if they haven't met the requirements, they're able to explain, because it's natural to do their business and the organization and their strategic requirements. So I think it goes back to educating the board and the NEDs on that board for that education, then to cascade down through the rest of the organization.
I was talking to somebody today who is the head of EDI at one of the largest UK banks, let's just say that, or financial services organizations. And they talk about colleagues, customers, and community. So those are the three areas where they always ask, what's the impact? And what this person was saying was they constantly go back to the customer. What is the effect of anything we're doing in EDI on the services that we provide for customers, opening up financial access to customers, opening up banking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one key thing that NEDs can do is always is work to root anything you do on EDI in that very specific way. Now, if you're B2B, it's going to be different. I give you the water example again, the water company. The water companies are regional monopolies. You can't get your water from anywhere else. Now, one of the questions that one of the companies we've worked with recently, so one of the questions they were asking is, right, we've got an area where there's a reason to compare what we do with the demography of the region. That makes sense because we're a regional monopoly. So are we offering opportunities to and getting talent from the range of the population of our region? And that is a good question to ask, because if you're not, you're missing out on talent. But the demographic baseline there works for them because they're a regional monopoly. It doesn't work for a global business school because what's their baseline? The world. So, I think the NEDs can come in and ask, what is that root question that is what you want the EDI strategy to achieve, and therefore work back from that kind of fundamental question. And interestingly, the person in the financial services said to me, actually, we've made pretty good progress in terms of the main sort of categories in relation to leadership, middle management, so on and so on. Actually, what I'm going to do is underplay. Yes, we'll monitor the data, we'll report the data. I want the focus of the discussion to be now on that strategic operation in relation to customers. And I thought that was a really interesting change. They've also got a responsible business committee underneath their board. So what the responsible business committee can do is a deeper dive and then bring specific issues. And that's what I would do. I think tackle these things bit by bit by bit, break them up. Don't just think EDI. Have that deeper dive in a working group or responsible, whatever you call it, and then work out what does that mean for the board and how do we then bring it to the board. I think that's quite a useful dynamic as well.
And I think, Simon, that segues really nicely, just by chance, into Ruby's question, which has just come online. So how do we ensure that EDI initiatives, so EDI, doesn't compromise the meritocracy of principles in terms of prioritizing identity over a candidate's simple skills and experience. So how do we separate the two and yet have some mind on EDI and what we're trying to achieve here strategically?
Well, I have a simple formulation for this. When you appoint people, it's not who they are, it's what they bring through who they are. So when you look at an appointment, you're always adding to a team. We do very little on our own. So when you look at your team, I call it the virtuous circle of selection. You go, what is this team or group or board or exec or whatever trying to achieve? What kind of combination of difference, brackets diversity, would help it to do that? So who have we got? So who do we want to add? So you're always thinking, who do we want to add to get the right mix round that team, round that table, round that board table or whatever? And then you say to people, you start to identify, don't you, what is it you're looking for? So, for instance, we were involved in the recruitment of a general counsel for an organisation that had just merged. And they kept on using the phrase, well, we want someone with gravitas. And I said to them, well, if you look up gravitas in the dictionary, it'll say middle-aged bloke.
Heavy.
But there's a sort of idea of what gravitas means. And I said, what do you really mean by that? What they really meant by that was they need somebody who could negotiate with both these boards in the period of transition and create a functioning single board after the merger. And they could get that right. Now, that's a very particular skill. It's not particularly male or female. It's a particular skill. So once you really start defining what you want, if, for instance, you want somebody to work, you're expanding into different territories, and your business strategy says, do you know what, Germany's the big market for us? Well, you're going to need insight. You don't just go and get any old German. You need a German. You might not need a German. You might need a British person who has a deep insight into German business, because it's not the who you're looking for. It's what that person can bring through their experience, personal and professional.
Nina, do you have anything here that chimes with Simon? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, something similar. To be honest, I often find across different client boards when they're going, whether they're replacing or appointing new individuals, sometimes if a certain individual's traits have worked in the past, they're almost looking to replace that particular individual, and that's impossible. And it's very often, well, this candidate looks great according to their CV or interview, but he's not quite the same as John, or she's not quite the same as John. And it won't be John. We have to be open and flexible to having someone else join the board, and that could expand the company and still meet whatever those requirements they're looking for, but they will be completely different from John. So the company can still achieve all their objectives with a different individual. So it's very important to be open and flexible in that aspect. Absolutely. Rather than replacing like for like.
I mean, think of a CEO. I mean, if you're appointing a CEO because you're about to go into a major phase of mergers and acquisitions or whatever, that's an entirely different CEO from the person that if you've just gone through a big spurt of growth, and what you want is you want her to come in and consolidate. These are different people. Why would you just think, oh, well, Joan was really good, let's get another Joan? That's you're really not paying attention. So, context really matters. I agree with Nina.
Absolutely. Conscious of time, Simon and Nina, so if we could leave our audience with one actionable insight, what would you recommend with your experience? Nina?
I would probably say for organizations to treat EDI the same way they treat audit and risk.
Very good.
Build it into your governance cycle, make it board owned, make it data-led, transparent, so all data is collected and reported. I think that shift alone will probably move EDI from compliance to strategic.
And fantastic advice, and something that even the smallest of companies can do, bringing EDI onto the table along with other pieces of actionable insight that have to be addressed in the boardroom. Absolutely. Simon, what's your actionable insight for the day? Be
specific, so that when you read whatever it is you produce, we call them a diversity framework, and we've got a process to do that. When you produce your diversity framework strategy, when you read it, you go, that is a set of actions designed to achieve a set of outcomes for my company. That you can identify it as your strategy for your company in your sector at this point in time of your company's strategic growth. So be specific.
Thank you. Also, excellent advice there, Simon. Thank you very much, both. I think somebody is probably about to call time on us. So before I do, I'd like to thank both Simon and Nina today for sharing both your insights, your thoughts, and expertise on this expansive topic, and all the examples, the live examples that you brought to the table. And the last little bit of housekeeping, the webinar, as I mentioned at the start, is part of a series of previous webinars, and they're all available to watch on the QCA YouTube channel. Perhaps it's the right time to hand back to you now, Paul.
Fantastic. Claire, Nina, Simon, thank you indeed for your webinar today. On behalf of the QCA, I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. That concludes today's session. Good afternoon.